For president in the 1920s, and thanks to Tina and Kelly for the warm introduction as well. So Frank Johns drowned here in Bend in Drake Park in a heroic effort to save a young boy, and you'll learn more about that and his life in this lecture. So readers of the Bend Bulletin in 1928 on May 21st were greeted with the following headline: Portland man offers life in effort to save Bend boy. Both sink in the icy Deschutes. Mother is helpless as son drowns. Jack Rhodes and Frank T. Johns die in river here Sunday evening. Bend tragedy victim well known in state. So I'm quoting from the article that you can see on the far right-hand side of the slide there. I'm going to extend my quote. The body of Frank T. Johns of Portland, the Socialist Labor candidate for President of the United States, who lost his life Sunday evening while attempting to save Jack Rhodes, 10-year-old son of Mr. and Mrs. J.C. Rhodes of this city from drowning, was taken from the Deschutes River opposite Drake Park at 8:45 o'clock this morning. The body of Jack was taken from the Deschutes at 9:50 last night, 1 hour and 50 minutes after Johns and the lad disappeared into the current of the main channel. So what happened here? How did this tragedy play out on the evening of May 20th? This is a historic photo of the footbridge that's no longer there, that went over the river in Drake Park, over Deschutes River. And there is a current footbridge there. It's not the same footbridge. But in the 1920s, this was the footbridge. And from that footbridge, on the evening of May 20th, a young boy named Jack Rhodes, who was 11 years old, was fishing for a trout. And he'd heard about this trout in the newspaper, actually, in the Bend Bulletin had reported. This is, I guess, the state of news in the early 1920s, but they'd reported that there was a large trout that had been seen a few times swimming around the middle part of the channel by the footbridge over the Deschutes River in Drake Park. So Jack Rhodes, all of 11 years old, had heard about this fish and set off with a few companions to try to catch him on this evening in May. He's fishing from about the middle part of that bridge when his hook gets caught underneath the bridge, and he leans over trying to disengage the hook from the beams beneath the bridge, and he tumbles into the river in the process. And this is spring, and the water's pretty high at that point. There's some snow melt going on, and the current is a bit stronger than what you see today in the Deschutes. And the temperature was probably just a little bit above freezing, so it's really cold. And so he falls in. He can't swim very well, so he starts calling for help from his comrades, from his friends that were fishing with him, and they extend a pole to try to get him to grab onto that pole and try to rescue him that way. But that pole breaks as well, and then he's sort of off into the middle of the channel and floating down the river. Meanwhile, at the bandstand, which you can see in the right-hand side of this photograph here, a politician visiting from Portland was giving an open-air speech, a speech in Drake Park to our mill workers and laborers and workers of the community. And there was probably about 100 people that were gathered there as the politician was giving his speech. And this politician was Frank Johns, seen here in this photograph, a Portland resident, a carpenter by trade, a devoted husband, father of 2 young children at that point, in his late 30s. And he's the presidential nominee for the Socialist Labor Party of America. So he's giving this speech in Drake Park. He hears the cries of the boy who's struggling against the current in the middle of the river, and he stops his speech, and this is quite a moment to imagine. He stops his speech and runs to the bank of the river and dives in. He flings off his coat and dives in, swimming toward the boy, calling for assistance from boats. And observers on the shore are calling out to the boy in the river, telling him to wait for Johns, for Frank Johns, who's on his way swimming out to him. So meanwhile, the boy's mother is located in the back lawn of her house. So that's 611 Northwest Drake Road, which you can see there with a little Google map. I've got the pin dropped there. That white line over the river is the footbridge equivalent. And that's where Jack's mother was. She realized there was a commotion going on. She called frantically for help because she knew that that was her boy calling for help from the river. And several bystanders from the other side of the river, opposite Drake Park, also leapt into the water in an attempt to save Jack, including his sister. And an unknown man, a man not recorded in history, almost made it out to the middle of the channel there to rescue Jack, but then he turned back. He was called back because people said, Frank's almost there from the other side, get back. And he just barely survived himself. This unknown person made it back to the western shore, just barely alive at that point. So Jack's fighting against the current in the middle of the river. That's a shot of the river around the 1920s. He's trying to tread water there, trying to hold on. And our politician, Frank Johns, reaches him eventually. And he tries to pull the boy with him back toward the eastern shore. And they both go under a few times. They keep on resurfacing. They're clearly struggling heavily against the current, against the icy temperatures. And eventually, Johns is seized with cramps, actually, from the freezing water. And he realizes at that point that he's probably not going to make it, that this is going to be kind of a last-ditch effort. And so with his final act in life, he pushes Jack toward the shore and then sinks beneath the water for the last time. He doesn't resurface again. So Jack, the boy, struggles on briefly, and he doesn't quite make it either. He also sinks about 10 feet from the shore, and he can't quite get to the eastern shore in time, and the current carries both of them away, and they both drowned that night. Rescue attempts, of course, were immediately dispatched. A patrol of boats was sent out. The Bend fire and police were out in full force. Grappling hooks were deployed. The gates of the dam were opened up, and impounded water went into the original channel to make it easier to search for the bodies at that point. And later that evening, they found Jack. They found Jack's dead body, and then the next morning they found Frank. And in the following days, here's a few articles from the Bend Bulletin. Starting with the article on the far left, City to honor Frank T. Johns, procession will escort body to train. I'm going to quote briefly from that article. Because the entire city is moved by the heroic act of the Portland man, it is expected that the honorary escort will include people from all walks of life, mill officials and employees, local business and professional men, and representatives of the city and civic organizations. So this is a big deal in Bend. There was a large community recognition of the supreme final effort given by someone that didn't have any real connection here, that was visiting on the middle of the campaign trail and who died, in this tragic effort to save a local boy. So further on in that article, the body will be taken from Niswonger Chapel to the station at 7:45, at which time the escort will march to the train, the Oregon trunk, which will leave at 8:15 o'clock. And that's exactly what happened. That's how they sent Frank's body back to Portland, Oregon, where he was from. And then the next day in the Bulletin, looking at that middle article there, final honors paid to Johns, quote, Bend paid impressive tribute to Frank T. Johns on Tuesday evening when scores of local folk, men, women, and children followed the body to the station where it was put on the evening train and sent to Portland. Shortly after that, a relief effort began in Bend. You'll see that headline there on the far right. Johns Relief Fund passes $700 total. So that was an effort led by our local Kiwanis Club to raise cash for Johns' widow and his 2 young children. And they sent over $700 to them in 1928, which in 2015 is roughly $10,000 or so. So that was a pretty nice effort there. This next slide shows a map of that funeral procession from the article quote. That's the roughly half-mile walk from where the funeral home is to where the train station depot used to be in Bend. It's no longer there, but that's the procession that they discuss in the article. That's how Ben sort of sent off his body to Portland. So in recognition of the efforts by Bend to recognize Frank Johns, his wife, his widow, sent a telegram which was quoted in full on the front page of the Bend Bulletin a couple days later. I'll read just a section of it here. To the citizens of Bend who have been so thoughtful and kind in memory of our beloved Frank T. Johns, please accept our heartfelt gratitude for your sympathy in our hour of sorrow. May we publicly express our sympathy to those whose loss was as great as our own, and our regrets that we were not able to be present at the service in Bend, which was so great a tribute. Final arrangements in Portland will be at the Central Library Hall on Saturday at 2 p.m. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on in this speech. So here's Frank T. Johns again, and the rest of our lecture tonight is going to be about who this man was, this man that so quickly and without a second of doubt was willing to offer his life in an effort to save a boy drowning in the river. We know he was a carpenter and a socialist. We know he was a father and a family man. And we'll spend the rest of the lecture answering some other questions about his life. So he was born out east in Sunbury, Pennsylvania. The postcard view on the top is the main street in Sunbury. Frank was born the 23rd of February, 1889, and he spent his first 15 years out east in Pennsylvania there, where his father worked in industry. You probably can't see it too well, but I do have a little pin dropped on that Google map in the bottom half of the slide showing you roughly where, kind of mid-state there in Pennsylvania, the town of Sunbury is. After 15 years, though, the family moved west. They went out to Spokane, Washington. They had a mutual dream of the open spaces of the West, and they left to homestead, to become homesteaders. But they were a little bit late with that goal, with that dream. And there weren't really any homesteads left by this point in time. This is the early 1900s. Most of the homesteads had been long spoken for at that point out here. And so Johns' father, who had hoped to leave his industrial life in the city behind him, had to return to factories in Spokane and went back to work there. And that's where Frank graduated from high school in 1910, Spokane. After graduation, the family moved down to Oregon, over to the ROSEBURG area. They had an opportunity to buy into a ranch, and they attempted to transition into the agricultural life, but unfortunately the ranch failed pretty quickly due to a lack of appropriate tools on their behalf, generally a bit of poor soil in that specific area where the ranch was, and a lack from the Johns' family of agricultural knowledge of how to make a ranch a viable operation. And those are pretty common problems for the people that came out west from the East Coast in that era looking to make a different life. It didn't always work out, of course. And 2 years later, the family returned again to Spokane, Washington, again seen here in the view. And this is about the winter of 1911 when they returned back to Washington State. At this point in time, Frank was 23 years old. And he started to work as a carpenter when he could, sort of a freelance carpenter. When work was available, he'd take it. And then sort of by random chance one day, he took a civil service exam and was hired by the post office. And that's the post office as it used to look anyway in Spokane, Washington. And Frank, at 23 years old, became a postal carrier in that town. And then shortly after that, he married Ruth Aurora Noble, seen here in a little bit of a blurry photograph, but that's Ruth. She was the daughter of pioneer residents of the Spokane area in Washington. Her father was a minister in the Methodist Episcopal Church, and they married in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho in 1911. 4 years later, in 1915, the first of 3 children was born, Margaret, the older daughter there, seen in the middle of the picture. And they had a son, not pictured here, who was born 3 years later in 1918, named Philip. And then Mildred was their third and final child, who was born in 1920. Mildred is the younger daughter seen in that family photograph there. So around the time that Frank turned 25 years old, it was 1915, and he met an influential figure in his later life, a fellow with the excellent name of Upton A. Upton. So I'm not making that up. That was really his name, Upton A. Upton. His parents thought that was a good idea for some reason. And Upton A. Upton, who's seen in this photograph here with the red circle around his face, and the man next to him and to your left is Frank Johns himself. Upton was an avid member of the Socialist Labor Party, which was active in those days in Washington, and he recruited Johns to the party in 1915. And Johns was a youthful convert, and with all the sort of zeal of youth, he threw himself into it. He would read party pamphlets while walking his mail route, and he started to present on party principles, on Socialist Labor Party principles, to the other postal workers in their break room, a practice which was frowned upon, as you can imagine, by his bosses there. But let's take a step back for a second to learn a little bit about who the Socialist Labor Party is and get introduced to kind of the milieu of left-wing politics in the early 20th century in the Pacific Northwest. So the Socialist Labor Party, seen here in one of their icons, was technically the first socialist party in the United States. And they were founded in 1877 as the Working Man's Party. Their primary principle, their primary goal was this concept of socialist industrial unionism, which is a belief and the fundamental transformation of society through the combined political and industrial action of the working class, organized into industrial unions. So what does that actually mean? It means they wanted to remove the political state entirely as it currently exists, which they felt only benefited capitalists, and instead they wanted to replace that with what they called the Socialist Industrial Republic, where instead of having representatives going off to a Congress equivalent from districts around the country, you would send representatives over from the major sections of labor. So it was kind of a utopian vision. Workers would control the means of production. It was kind of Marxist in that way. And the point there was for the sake of economic security. Then they felt there would be no unemployment, no wars, and no want, and labor would be essentially controlling all of government at that point. So that was the Socialist Labor Party. They were essentially guided by the political philosophy of the fellow seen here in this slide, Daniel de Lyon, and you can see his quote there. I'll read it just in case you can't. Socialism is that social system under which the necessaries of production are owned, controlled, and administered by the people, for the people, and under which accordingly the cause of political and economic despotism having been abolished, class rule is at an end. And that is socialism, nothing short of that. So this fellow had immigrated from Curacao, which is a Caribbean island, and he took over the party in 1890. So this is well before Frank became active in this party. And he essentially turned it into a Marxist organization, which is represented in a way by the sort of defining quote there I put up from him. And a central axiom, a central aspect of Marxism is that the liberation of the working class has to come from the hands of the working class itself. And that's something the Socialist Labor Party fully embraced. And they felt the working class must remake and rework the political state. And that's what I was talking about earlier with sending, instead of geographic representatives, sending industrial or worker representatives over to a Congress equivalent. They're hoping to rebuild the entire political structure of the United States in the workers' image. So separate from that is the Socialist Party of America, and this is where it gets a little bit confusing. But Daniel de Lyon's opponents, who were mostly German Americans or Jewish immigrants of various origins, and as well as trade unionists, left the Socialist Labor Party in force in 1899. So at that point in time, there was still only one Socialist Party in America. This is the one that I was just describing. But in 1899, a bunch of people left that party. They were frustrated with the direction it was going, and they created a new party called the Socialist Party of America, which is what most people think of today. When they think of socialism in America in the early 20th century, this is the party they're thinking of. This is the one that was long headed by that most prominent voice of 20th century socialism, Eugene Debs, who I'm sure is a familiar name to some folks in the room here. Seen here in action, in fiery action. He was known as a fiery orator, someone who could stir up a crowd, and was extremely charismatic and very good at political speeches. He came to national attention owing to his pro-union role in the Pullman strike, and he was sent to jail, where he spent his whole time in jail avidly studying Marxist and socialist philosophies, and he emerged from jail as a prominent, well, self-educated socialist. And he ran, in the early 20th century, he ran 5 times for president, and revolution at that point in time was very much in the air in a way that's very different from it is today. There was a real feeling from workers in the early 20th century that there was the possibility of transforming completely American society as they knew it. So all this ferment and all this political unrest is going on in the background while our Frank Johns is a postal carrier, newly converted to the Socialist Labor Party in Spokane, Washington, where Johns is increasingly committed as he sort of gets more and more enveloped into this party's philosophy. He's increasingly committed to the Socialist Labor Party principles, to the point where eventually he's fired. They let him go at the post office. They fired him for distributing to co-workers pamphlets of Socialist Labor Party material, which, you know, he must have seen that coming, you know. But I think his revolutionary zeal was such that he thought it was worth the risk. So out of a job, Johns and his young family at that point in time moved down here to Oregon, to Portland. And he took a job in the foundation shipyards between 1918 and 1920. And he later wrote that during this 2-year period of his life, he received a liberal education in the conduct of industry and an experience which made clear the application of socialist industrial unionism in every branch of industrial life. So that photograph is of Portland, Oregon, around the time that Johns would have first moved there. In addition to working in the foundation shipyards, he also took up freelance work as a carpenter when he could, which was sort of the occupation that defined him in the eyes of the press, later on in life, in the eyes of the public. That's a press shot later of him working as a carpenter. So he's kind of developing a reputation as a working man, as a proletariat, a man of the people. And he falls in with this crowd. This is literally a photograph of Oregon socialists gathered together for a meeting in a Portland bar around the same time that Johns would have been active in the area. So again, the Socialist Labor Party that Johns was committed to was a separate entity from the Socialist Party. And that's the confusing point, so I'll try to reiterate that on occasionally. But socialism in a general sense at this point in time in the Pacific Northwest was very active, very well supported. Socialist votes had declined on the national scale between 1904 and 1908, but in that same period of time they'd made substantial gains up here in the Pacific Northwest. And Eugene Debs, that fiery orator we talked about a little bit earlier, he actually received 8% of the Oregon vote, which is not insubstantial for a third-party candidate in 1904, and he visited several spots while he was touring around on his red special train in 1908, several spots in Oregon. And thousands of participants paraded around for a May Day socialism parade in 1910. So both Portland and Seattle in the early 20th century were hotbeds of far left-wing thought, of left-wing activity. They were pretty industrial towns at that point in time. A lot of workers, a lot of socialists, communists, Marxists, etc. So in 1920, Frank Johns starts leading an effort to get the Socialist Labor Party on the ballot in Oregon. And he launches a petition, which you'll see headlines of here from the Oregonian, which collected 8,688 names, which was more than the 5% that you're required to find in order to, 5% of the previous election's total vote cast in order to get a new party put on the ballot in Oregon. But the Socialist Labor Party name was found to be in conflict with the Socialist Party name, which makes sense because it's already confusing with me talking about it, I'm sure too. So they deemed that the name, the Socialist Labor Party, couldn't be used, and instead the Industrial Labor Party was born, which was just a slight change of the name in order to get it on the ballot in Oregon. But that's why these headlines here say, Oregon has new party, industrial labor ready for November fray and industrial labor petitions, etc. So the Industrial Labor Party in Oregon was the exact same thing as what was nationally considered the Socialist Labor Party. So they held their convention in August, and they nominated Johns at that point to run for Congress from Oregon's 3rd District, which is one of our Portland-based districts. So this is 1920. And on the national stage, just to give you a little bit of context, what's going on in 1920 nationally is that Senator Harding is running for the Republicans for the presidency, and he wins in a landslide victory over James Cox. So Harding is shown on the upper right there, who would become the president in 1920. He defeated James Cox, seen just beneath him there. But the cartoon here is interesting because it shows Eugene Debs, again that kind of fiery socialist fellow from earlier. That's him launching an entire campaign from a prison cell, which is true, he did. He was in jail at the time for sedition and launched a national scoped presidential campaign from the confines of his prison cell, which is kind of awesome. He was serving a 10-year sentence at the time, and he managed to attract 3.4% of the national vote in 1920, which is about 913,664 people voted for him while he was in prison, which is a huge number, actually. That's an extraordinarily high amount for someone that's a socialist and in prison to attract from an American campaign. So that, again, just to reiterate that fact that revolution is in the air, that real sense of left-wing political possibility is kind of hovering in the background. Johns himself didn't fare so well in the 1920 election. This is the headline from the Oregonian later on. He received 3,252 votes and was defeated by both of the major parties, and a Republican, C.N. MacArthur, won the seat. But interestingly, a Democrat named Dr. Esther Pohl Lovejoy came in 2nd place in the 1920 election for Oregon's 3rd District, and she would later become a very prominent Oregon voice. Maybe some folks have heard of her before, but she was an early female candidate for office and led kind of Oregon's suffragette movement to some extent. So anyway, that was kind of cool that she was on the ballot too in 1920 and did well. So 2 years later, Johns runs again. In the meantime, he holds various public debates and speeches when he can. And in 1922, he's again nominated for Oregon's 3rd Congressional District, again a Multnomah-based district. And here's the vote counts from that. He received 2,259 votes. He was in 4th place that year, well behind the leading candidates. You can kind of see him over here on the right-hand side. So, you know, there was about 86,000 votes for the 1st place and then 33,000 for the 2nd. And Johns was down there at 4th place with 2,000 some votes. So just to give you some background then on how the Socialist Labor Party was operating in Portland, they had headquarters sort of up and down the West Coast in Los Angeles and San Francisco and Oakland, Seattle, Spokane, and Tacoma, as well as Portland. And their Portland office is seen here in an old building called the Wooster Building, which has since been destroyed. Unfortunately, it seems like it would have been kind of a lovely building today, but it was right downtown in Portland. If you are familiar with Portland at all, that's Burnside Street there on the upper part of that little map insert, and the Wooster Building was just a little bit south of that. And the Socialist Labor Party had their headquarters on the 4th floor of that building, so kind of where that arrow is pointing, that's where they hung out. Hi. Come on in, feel free. So Johns was a regular attendee at their weekly meetings here in the Wooster Building. They had meetings every Saturday at 7:30 p.m. The first Saturday of the month was a business meeting. The second Saturday of the month was a study class where they'd study socialist principles. The third Saturday was an open forum, and the fourth Saturday was a study class. And finally, if you were lucky enough to get a fifth Saturday in that month, that was a social gathering. So I always think that's kind of funny. They're a very serious outfit, very serious, very committed to their principles. So only if by chance there was 5 Saturdays in a given month, then that fifth one, they didn't worry about studying or like, hi, welcome. So everyone was always welcome though at these meetings, and their reading room, which they also maintain at this office in Portland, was always open. So this building though, the Wooster Building, was demolished unfortunately in 1941, so it's long gone from Portland. Another center of activities for the Socialist Labor Party in Portland was Central Library, which is still there, part of Multnomah County Library System. And they would host visiting lectures from prominent labor leaders there. That photograph is today what the Central Library looks like. I have a few articles quoted on the right. I'll just read one example of an event that was hosted by the Socialist Labor Party in the library. Section Portland, so that's what they call themselves, Section Portland or Section Los Angeles or Section Oakland. Section Portland delivered a telling blow to the decadent capitalist system when it commemorated the 57th anniversary of the Paris Commune with a get-together and series of speeches at Hall A at Central Library. So, you know, people partied in a little bit different way back then, I think, than they do now. But the article goes on to mention that the Socialist Labor Party was allowed rent-free use of the room, but were denied the right to sell literature or to take a collection. So I think the writer of the article is kind of frustrated by that point. But that's something we keep to today. So you're right now in a meeting room of a public library, and I cannot sell you guys literature, and I cannot take a collection, even if I wasn't on the staff of the library, which complicates things even further. But it's just kind of interesting to see how some of those things stay the same over all these years.
What year was that?
That was 1924, I think. Yeah. So Johns in this time period is kind of building a national name for himself by contributing to a newspaper called The Weekly People, which you can see here, which was the official publication of the Socialist Labor Party of America. And Johns would contribute editorials and articles about activities going on in the Pacific Northwest, or Oregon in particular. And for example, there was an article he wrote called "Reform Straws Show How the Revolutionary Wind Blows." That's the one seen on the right there. And this "Cry for Help," that's another Frank T. Johns authored article. You can see his initials there at the bottom that came out in the Weekly People. And the point there was to start to build a national name recognition for him, at least within the confines of the Socialist Labor Party. So while he was running these relatively unsuccessful campaigns for Congress from Oregon's 3rd District, he's also contributing to the national newspaper for the Socialist Labor Party. And he was a contributing member, of course, by paying his monthly dues. This is actually his card showing his monthly dues. So you can see here, you know, in July on such and such day, 1924, he paid his $1 monthly dues. So that's your kind of card you'd carry around with you if you were a member of the Socialist Labor Party, and this is be proof that you're a dues-paying member, that you contribute to the financial well-being of the organization. So that's Johns's actual card, which we're lucky to come across. And then in 1924, the Socialist Labor Party on the national level holds their convention in New York City. And Johns attended the convention as the representative of Oregon, and he left the convention a mere 3 days later as the nominee for president from the Socialist Labor Party. So how did this happen? How did he quickly make such an impression? A few things contributed to that. He had youth. He was in his early 30s at this time, just a hair over the minimum required age to run for president. So just a hair over 35. And he has good looks going for him. He has sincerity, which was commented on a lot of his character from reviewers of his speeches and so on. He had bona fide working man credentials, meaning, you know, he'd paid his dues, he'd worked for the post office, he'd worked in the shipyards in Portland, he'd worked as a carpenter, and he had a very firm and clear understanding of the Socialist Labor Party principles. So he was this invigorating choice for the party to run in a national presidential campaign in 1924. His style of speaking was considered to be quiet and sincere and kind and determined. I would love to hear one of his speeches. Unfortunately, none of them seem to have survived history. He did a lot of interviews with radio and so on, and so I have a hope that at some point in time something will surface again. But I've never actually heard John's speech. But later observers would write of him when he'd take the stage. I'm going to quote from an observation. "Quietly, Johns takes the platform like a professor before his class of pupils, but without a patronizing air of a know-it-all. He never talks down to his hearers, but as a scientist launched with his audience on an interesting tour of discovery, where he and they delve into the material at hand together, ready for anything that may turn up." So he leaves, actually, as a little point of political trivia, as the youngest ever presidential candidate, 200 days over 35 years old, which is the minimum age requirement to run as a presidential nominee. This fellow, Reynolds, was nominated for the vice president ticket on the Socialist Labor Party. He's also pretty young. He's 40 years old at the time. So this is a young ticket and a balanced pairing in the eyes of the Socialist Labor Party. This fellow, Reynolds, was in contrast with Johns a lot more fiery. He was kind of the agitator or the fighter in a given situation. He was the son of a missionary. He was widely traveled. He also came out of a failed ranch, but in his case it was in California. And when he ran on the vice presidential ticket for the Socialist Labor Party, he was a Baltimore pipe fitter. That's what he was working for. And so a quote about the pairing: "It is difficult to imagine two men on the surface more unlike in essentials, but more similar in essentials than Johns and Reynolds. But both possess the same courage and the same unbounded and unswerving, and at the same time well-balanced enthusiasm and the same faith. The faith in the working class to accomplish its own and final emancipation from the thraldom of the ages. And in methods, Johns, though he burns with no lesser zeal, is less the fiery agitator. Johns is a teacher and Johns is a builder." So that's what an observer of their two speaking styles commented on later on. Johns wrote a lengthy letter of acceptance for the presidential nominee. That's on the front page of the Weekly People, which again is the national newspaper of the Socialist Labor Party. And I'm going to quote from this. It's useful just to hear a little bit of Johns from his own voice. So I'm just going to quote a section of this so you can hear what he thought about this nomination, what he thought about the party principles. Quote, "The issue is clear and distinct, and all the efforts of the two old parties to wave it aside are of no avail. The question before society at the coming election is this: shall capitalism, which means the continued and intensified exploitation of the working class, be allowed to exist, which implies in turn a continuance of all its ill effects of wars and unemployment and poverty and sickness and premature death, or shall capitalism be replaced by a new and modern socialist system of production that shall assure to the workers the full product of their toil, thereby freeing them from want, and what is still worse, fear of want. For capitalism stands for a continuation of freedom of competition with all the waste of human labor and natural resources that this implies. Socialism, by contrast, is synonymous with collective ownership, with operation and control by the workers of the means of production and distribution, not only eliminating the waste of present capitalism, but resulting in setting free all the potential productive forces that lie dormant within the present framework of society for the benefit of the whole human race, which I think is kind of a powerful quote, and hearing from Johns himself writing into the Weekly People here. So this is the Rogues Gallery in 1924. This is everyone that's running for the presidential ticket. So you have Calvin Coolidge, who at that point in time is a sitting president, seen in the left here, upper left. He's a Republican. He's running for re-election. He's running against his main opponent is the fellow in the middle there. That's John Davis, a congressman from West Virginia, who's a Democrat. And then entering the ring as well was the fellow on the far right in that upper row there, that Senator Fightin' Bob La Follette from Wisconsin. That might be a familiar name to some folks here. An extremely prominent voice in progressive political thought in the early 20th century. And he had formerly been part of the Republican Party back when the Republican Party had a very avid liberal wing, which isn't so much the case anymore. But he, at that point in time, even got frustrated with the liberal wing of the Republican Party and left it to form what was called the Progressive Party. And he wanted to give liberals from both parties an alternative voice, an alternative chance to vote in a different direction. So he was running on a third party ticket. That's Fighting Bob La Follette there in the upper right. Of course, it's a black and white photograph, but he had this sort of shocking red hair, and that was part of his whole sort of persona, this sort of fiery orator. So then on the lower level there, we have the kind of slightly less or minor candidates. On the far left is Herman Ferris, who's representing the Prohibition Party. So Prohibition in 1924 was a big deal, and to the point where there's actually a whole party that their sole political philosophy, in a way, was just the inaction of prohibition. So, and he was running for the presidential ticket for the Prohibition Party. The fellow in the middle there is William Forster. He's from the Communists. So in addition to these sort of socialist organizations, the Communists are also active. That's Foster from the Communists, and then there's our fellow Frank Johns there in the bottom right, representing the Socialist Labor Party. But in Johns's mind, in the mind of the party as a whole, it was really a fight between him and La Follette, that senator from Wisconsin who I talked about a little bit earlier. So the Socialist Party had thrown their support behind La Follette, and when I say the Socialist Party, again, this is where we're separating out Johns's Socialist Labor Party from a separate organization called the Socialist Party of America. That's the party of Eugene Debs, and that's the party that threw their support behind Fighting Bob La Follette there. They were so supportive of that senator that they didn't even run their own candidate that year. So La Follette was the primary challenge to socialist votes in this election, and he was backed by prominent labor unions, by radical farmers, which was the big part of the progressive section in the early 20th century, and by progressives from around the country. So how do you convince progressives to vote for you? For these two candidates, it was a competition between reforming or rebuilding society. So Fighting Bob La Follette's idea was that you need to kind of restructure society from within the current organization, whereas Frank Johns was more, let's just trash the whole thing and rebuild it in a different way. So both candidates take to the road. They're traveling by train around the country. There's a train shot from that era. This long list of towns there on the right are all the places that Frank visited in the 1924 election while he went out on the speaking circuit. I made a little Google map showing everywhere he went to, and there's a little piece of ephemera there just showing one of the advertisements for one of his meetings. In that case, that's one of the meetings in Massachusetts. But he started out here in Portland, Oregon, worked his way down the West Coast, through the Middle West, and then up into, as you can see there, he kind of finished off in New York after a few stops in some of the industrial hotbeds around Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio. So you can see some of the sections he skipped, which is sort of telling as well. The South was largely avoided. The South was considered lost to their votes because John Davis was a West Virginian Democrat running for the ticket, and all of the South kind of block voted for Davis. And they also skipped the upper Midwest, like Wisconsin and Minnesota and the Dakotas, for example, which were considered lost already to La Follette, who was a senator from Wisconsin, had a lot of upper Midwest support. So they focused on the Rust Belt, Midwestern industrial towns, and New England. So how do you run a third-party campaign in 1924? It's a whole different can of worms, really, than what they do nowadays. So instead of sort of these national televised debates, it's a lot more gritty, and I think it's kind of more fun in a way. You know, they take over little party offices. They take over literally a block. You know, you just walk down a block, you set down a soapbox, you get up on it, and you start your stump speech. You know, street corners, you give multiple speeches in a given day. So maybe you give your speech on the corner of Wall Street at 10 a.m., then you head to Drake Park, you give a speech there at 2 p.m. And I just kind of like that aspect to it. I think that's kind of cool. They were scrappy and hard-fought affairs, especially for these third-party candidates, as we consider them in the 1920s. And sometimes they literally, you know, would have to fight for their street corner. Here's some more campaign ephemera in the meantime. There was one stop that was recorded on his tour that was out east. I think it was in Buffalo, New York, where the Socialist Labor Party had thought they'd reserved a corner, and they had. So they showed up at this corner and they're ready to give their speech. But the problem is, by virtue of reserving the street corner with the city officials, the other political parties in the area knew about it as well. So when Johns gets up to give his speech on the street corner, suddenly a marching band comes along the corner, which had been paid for by a competing third party in order to purposely interrupt his speech. So for an hour he had to kind of step aside and wait for this elaborate band to pass by. And then he got back on his soapbox in his speech again, and then the rain started in force. You know, so like you just kind of imagine it's a totally different era. Than it's a bit soft, I think, in 2015, a little different nowadays. But I like the idea of a political speech being interrupted by a marching band and what you have to do to fight back. But yeah, these little pieces of ephemera here are just from some of the different meetings he spoke at during the 1924 campaign, and that's how they were advertised. So the 1924 campaign finished in New York City at a place called Cooper Union on October 21st. Cooper Union, which might be a familiar name to some folks here, that's a private liberal arts school in New York City. They offer full scholarships to every student that's accepted there, and they've prided themselves for a long time, since 1859, on not discriminating in any way. So it had a long-term reputation as a working man's college, a way to, no matter what your background was, a way you could get ahead in life. And this is where Johns gave the most famous speech of his career. So I'll briefly quote from that, which is quoted in full in the article on the right. There's but one issue confronting the working class of America, and that demands the complete surrender of the capitalist class. The Socialist Labor Party stands squarely upon this issue and beckons to the working class to organize itself politically and industrially to establish the Socialist Industrial Republic of Labor, the only program in line with the further progress of the human race. So that's just a quote from his famous Cooper Union speech. A commentator who attended that speech wrote of it, "Johns spoke fluently but calmly, with scarcely a gesture, and with extreme sincerity and seriousness throughout, but which made the flashes of unpretentious humor with which his speech was punctuated all the more delightful as they came so unexpectedly. It was evident that the minute Johns started to speak, he had the audience with him. They sat in rapt attention, anxious not to lose a single word." So that gives you a sense of what his speech style was like, or what it was like to be in attendance at one of his political speeches in the 1920s. In this slide here, you see the information that went out to all the Oregon voters in 1924, and they had, you know, they list everyone's statements and arguments of the various political parties, and the Socialist Labor Party, along with the other parties, had an opportunity to sort of put in their argument for why you should vote for them. That's the actual one that went out to Oregon voters in the 1920s. They took over 5 pages of that brochure devoted to their campaign philosophy. And here are the county-wide results in 1924. Johns, after his Cooper Union speech, returned to Portland, Oregon, and watched as Calvin Coolidge sailed easily to a re-election in 1924. Even in a little bit of political trivia again, he even took New York City, which is the last time a Republican has ever won New York City, so 1924. A little while ago now, almost 100 years. Davis is the blue in the south there. That's that congressman, the Democratic congressman from West Virginia. All the red are the Republican counties across the nation at that point in time voting for Coolidge. Follette, though, that senator from Wisconsin fighting Bob, he did really well for a third-party candidate. He won all the electoral votes from Wisconsin, his home state, all 8 votes, and earned in the end about 4.8 million of the popular vote, which was 16%, which is a huge number. So he really did have kind of a good chance. You can see he won quite a bit of votes all over the upper Midwest, but also out in the West a bit too. So the Socialist Labor Party with Johns on the ticket was not on the ballot nationally. They only were able to get on the ballot in 20 states. And in those 20 states, Frank won 28,633 votes, which sounds nice, except it's actually only 0.1% of the total popular vote. So, but you know, it's important to keep in mind too that in no way did the Socialist Labor Party think they had a shot at winning this election. It was more about getting their revolutionary ideas out into a wider public, you know, kind of spreading the Socialist Labor Party message to as many willing listeners as they could find. So question, yeah. Texas.
The little green, is that Austin?
That would make sense. I'm not sure if it is. I wonder if Austin was the liberal mecca it is today, you know. Nowadays, Austin's the little blue dash surrounded by red in Texas, but that's a good question. Yeah, it's interesting, Diana, just to see how voting went. But so Johns, meanwhile, Johns returned to Portland. Again, that's a photograph of Portland around the mid-1920s where he returned to his family, and he resumed work as a carpenter around 1924. And he continued to play a prominent role in local Socialist Party politics. Again, that's a photograph of him, which you saw earlier, working as a carpenter, a common press photo of him of the era, establishing his working man credentials. So 4 years go by, 1928 shows up, another presidential election year, and the Socialist Labor Party was very happy with how their campaign had been run in 1924. And so at the 1928 S.L.P convention, again in New York City, they nominated the same two people. So again, they ran Johns in the presidential ticket and Reynolds from Baltimore on the vice presidential ticket. They wrote about this 4 years ago when they were candidates for the same offices. They toured the country and addressed audiences in cities from coast to coast. Their voices reached the ears of millions via the radio. The press throughout the country carried news stories of the S.L.P campaign and thus brought the names of Johns and Reynolds to the attention of millions of readers. So since the end of 1924, the two candidates have kept their party work at top notch. Both have frequently appeared in the columns of the weekly People, either as authors of articles or in reports of their activities. And one of those activities was the formation of a section in Bend, Oregon, a section of the Socialist Labor Party, which was spearheaded by Johns, who came down here and did some organizational work to get an active local section. And honestly, we know almost nothing else about it except what I just said there. We just know that the Socialist Labor Party did briefly have an active section in Bend, Oregon, but who was involved in that and what their activities were remain, for the moment, lost to history. Hopefully that'll be uncovered at some point. But in the 1928 campaign on the national level, Calvin Coolidge, after having been reelected in 1924, declined the nomination. So instead, the Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover, who would later go on to infamy, of course, ran on the Republican ticket, seen there on the left hand of the slide. This is the roaring 20s at this point. The rich were getting richer. The Secretary of Commerce was an exciting choice for those people benefiting from that to nominate for the president. And his main competitor in 1928 was Governor Al Smith of New York, the middle photograph there, who had the Democratic nomination, a very popular fellow for the Democrats anyway, and very liberal, very progressive, but he had one big strike against him, and that was that he was the first Roman Catholic to be nominated for a national office, which it's hard to imagine now, but in that era, that was a really big deal. And there was a lot of negative campaigning going on against his Roman Catholic background, and one of the kind of famous things that came out of that was that there was a real fear that was spread by the Republicans that if a Democrat who was a Roman Catholic actually won the presidency, that the Pope would relocate from the Vatican City to Washington, D.C., and that America would become a Roman Catholic theocracy. And that was believed to the point where Al Smith did pretty terrible, actually, in the national campaign, which is kind of an interesting thing. You know, of course, we've elected a Roman Catholic since then, but in 1928, that was still a real fear. And then for your sort of third-party candidates in 1928 election, on the upper right there, you have Norman Thomas. So he was the heir to Eugene Debs. He's running from the kind of more standardized Socialist Party of America. Beneath him, you have William Foster, who ran in the previous election as well for the Communists, again representing the Communist Party. And then in the bottom there is our fellow, Frank Johns, with the Socialist Labor Party. So only a week after receiving the nomination for presidency from his party, Johns began his presidential tour, and his first stop was to visit here in Bend, Oregon. And that's a photograph of Bend in the 1920s, looking over Wall Street, which is the street, of course, that's right outside our window here tonight. And Frank Johns arrived on the 20th of May, 1928, accompanied by a local friend, Oliver Stromquist. And this is just 1 week after his nomination. He was here on a Sunday evening as a guest of a local family for dinner. This is a photograph of some of the mill workers in that era. These would have been the potential recruits, the people that Johns would have been trying to get to vote for him. So those are the same workers he tried to attract to his Drake Park speech, which he gave the next day. And on that evening, as we learned in the first part of our lecture tonight, on that evening at 8 p.m., Johns met his fate on the Deschutes River 1 week into his campaign. Again, this is a photograph of the Deschutes River around 1928, and that's where he drowned while trying to save Jack Rhodes from the middle of the river, who also drowned himself. So after Johns died, after he died in the river here, newspapers around the country picked up the story. And the Socialist Labor Party as a unit, as a national organization, it was hit very hard by the news. One quote is, in New York, the sad news fled over the telephone from house to house among our comrades and spread gloom and depression everywhere. One of the New York papers has the article, "Johns dies a hero," but he did far more than that, for he lived a hero. So his tragic death was of course a huge blow to the party, but it was also seen in a way as sort of an expression of their principles that they've been trying to publicize anyway. You know, this whole idea of looking out for your fellow man. I mean, is there a more supreme gesture of that than offering your life to save a stranger? You know, and here Johns had implemented that so deeply into his personal philosophy, into his actions, that without a pause for consideration or doubt, he plunged into the river and tried to save this boy from drowning, only to die himself. So the body was sent back to Portland, Oregon, and Johns at that point in time was living on East 40th Street, and a funeral was arranged by the Socialist Labor Party and presided over by his comrades in the organization. And rather intriguingly, the funeral was held out of the Central Library in downtown Oregon, and the librarians asked, you know, while they approved the request, they asked why would we hold a funeral, you know, at the library. And there's a quote about that from Johns's friend, from Oliver Stromquist, who had accompanied him throughout his final days here in Bend. And he said, "The library is a temple of knowledge, and it was to this place that Comrade Johns often came, not only in his capacity as a teacher of science in lecture rooms, but also to seek knowledge. And so I can think of no place so appropriate to bury him from." So they held the funeral in the downtown branch of the library in Portland. And that's a request I think we've yet to receive here. Tina, is that right? Have we not had a funeral request yet? Okay. Well, and this next photograph here shows the extensive flower arrangement that was organized by the party for Johns's funeral there. So his body was buried in a cemetery called Rose City Cemetery in Portland. And Jack Rhodes, meanwhile, the boy that drowned in the river, was buried here in Bend in the Greenwood Cemetery, which is part of our kind of main cemetery over by Pilot Butte here. So I've tried twice to locate Frank's grave, which is recorded as being on a certain plot in this Rose City Cemetery in Portland, but I have yet to find it. I am not sure if it's been so overgrown with grass that I can no longer locate it, or what's going on exactly. But both times I've been on a short time frame, so I haven't been able to investigate as thoroughly as I'd like. But I hope eventually to find his actual grave and photograph it. I don't have a photograph of it here tonight, just of their entrance sign to Rose City Cemetery. And the photograph on the right is from our own Greenwood Cemetery here in Bend, and that's the boy that died in the river with Frank that evening. So memorials took place across the country. All the different sections of the Socialist Labor Party hosted memorial services, sent in letters of condolence both to the Weekly People, which was the national newspaper for the organization, as well as to Johns's widow in Portland. And one quote I think kind of sums it up well. Now Johns has left us, and he's left under circumstances so heroic, so humane, and so dramatic that however much we may futilely rebel at the combination of events that conspired to snatch him away, we still dare not regret the event itself. To wish that Frank had, in that moment, done otherwise than he did would be to wish he had been another than he was. For being the Frank that we knew, fearless, noble, unselfish, and self-sacrificing for humanity's sake, to the very depth of his being, he could have not done otherwise. He is one of whom we may say he loved both wisely and well, for he was humanity's lover, which I thought was kind of a touching memorial to Frank, sent in by a fellow comrade. So the campaign struggled on. In 1928, Herbert Hoover sailed to an extremely easy victory for the Republicans. Of course, that would be the last major Republican victory for a number of years, because this is 1928, and what happens the next 4 years, of course, is the big Wall Street crash and the start of the Great Depression, and 4 years later, Roosevelt would, of course, win for the Democrats and then stay in office for 4 more terms. So, but at this point in time, as I mentioned earlier, everyone was making money, everyone was happy with that, or at least the people that had the power to steer how people voted. So Herbert Hoover easily won. He defeated Al Smith. Again, they ran a pretty strong anti-Catholic campaign. The blue are all the only counties around the nation that Al Smith won that year. He didn't even carry his own state where he was governor of New York. So you know it's bad when you don't carry your own state. Vern Reynolds, who was the vice president on the Socialist Labor Party ticket, was of course pushed into the presidential ticket after Frank drowned here. And he managed to generate 21,590 votes in 1928, which is about 7,000 less votes than Frank had won 4 years previous in 1924, or about 0.05% of the total popular vote in 1928. And the Socialist Labor Party as an entity continued on for many years, actually, and in 1972, so not in the far distant past, 1972, a fellow named Louis Fisher, and he actually got the most S.L.P. votes in history. He won 52,000 votes, so quite a bit higher than either Frank or Vern, but that's just a little bit of political trivia. Going back to 1928, an effort was soon launched to award the Carnegie Medal to Frank for his heroic final efforts in life. And the Carnegie Award goes to individuals in the United States and Canada who, quote, risk their lives to an extraordinary degree, saving or attempting to save the lives of others. So there was an effort that was spearheaded by our local paper, the Bend Bulletin, and by John Rhodes, the father of Jack, who had drowned in the river. They led the effort to award the Carnegie Medal. And the reason they were adamant about that effort was that in addition to the sort of designation of earning the medal itself, it comes with an endowment, and there was an awareness, of course, that Johns had left a young widow and 2 young daughters behind him, and so they were hoping that that little bit of money from the Carnegie endowment would help them survive. The Oregonian came out with an editorial in support of the effort to award the Carnegie Medal. They said, "The people of Oregon will unite with the father of the unfortunate boy in hoping that the commission will act promptly and favorably upon its application," and they did. They did receive the award. This is the front page of the Oregonian, and the article toward the right there, "Widow of Hero Gets Timely Aid," is in reference to Ruth, to Frank's wife Ruth, and they had a monthly sum that was allocated to them. This is in 1929, January of 1929, and that monthly sum was $80 a month, which went a long way in 1928, and that's the actual medal that was awarded to the family in a posthumous gesture for Frank's efforts to save Jack Rhodes. So Ruth said in a quote to the Oregonian, "I'm very glad about the award for the children's sake. The award will help them greatly in getting their education." So at that point in time, there was 2 surviving children. If you remember from earlier in the lecture, they had 3 children at one point, but while Frank was still alive, their young son, Philip, died during a diphtheria outbreak in the early 1920s in Portland, which was a pretty common cause of death, of early childhood death in that era. So by the time Frank died in the river here, there was 2 surviving daughters, and you can see both daughters at that point in time in 1929 there in the bottom part of that photograph with Ruth. That's Margaret and Mildred. So Ruth used the money she received from the Carnegie Endowment to pay off her house. They had a small house up there in Portland, but her story ended shortly after, because in 1936 she caught a bad case of pneumonia herself, and it weakened her heart to the extent that she died shortly after that. Sorry, that was in 1926. I think I just said 1936, but she died in 1933. So that was only 5 years after Johns had died himself in the river. She was only 44 when she died. That's a photo of Ruth toward the end of her life there in the middle. And then her daughters and Frank's daughters are pictured there surrounding that. And that photograph has a sort of a water pipe that's been turned into a flower bed, which was something Frank had done. He'd converted this flower box out of a former industrial water pipe. So that's what she's leaning against there. So the older daughter, Margaret, moved to Bend here, actually. So she left Portland and moved to Bend, Oregon when she was 18 years old. Well, we don't know for sure. We think it was to live near Frank's sister, who at that point in time was in the 1930s a Bend resident and would later move out to Redmond. And Margaret actually became a Bend water pageant princess, which might mean something to some folks here. That we don't carry that tradition on anymore. But in that period of time, that was a pretty big deal in Bend. So she was sort of the equivalent of, the homecoming queen, but times 5 or 6 or something like that. So she became a Bend water princess. And Margaret eventually moved to Prineville, where she married and had 2 children of her own, one of whom is here with us tonight. So I'm going to just turn the spotlight briefly over to Phil, if you don't mind saying hello. So Phil Michael, he's a Prineville resident today and the grandson of Frank Johns, and thank you for coming tonight. Phil has come to a few of these lectures and has been extremely helpful in my research into Frank's story, and all the best photographs you saw tonight were courtesy of Phil. All the great sort of ephemera was courtesy of Phil as well. So thank you again. And you can see Margaret's her other child is pictured there in the middle photograph, and then that's a photograph of Phil with one of the kind of classic photos of Frank here. So in 1970, a friend of labor, as was quoted in the Bend Bulletin, erected a memorial to Frank, and this was the article that came out in 1970 about that. A commemorative plaque was installed in Drake Park overlooking the river. We don't know exactly who was behind this. It's kind of a mystery. In the paper, they were just quoted as being a friend of labor, which opens a lot of potential possibilities. And with help from the Allied Christian Foundation, in 1970, they installed this memorial, which is still there today. And a lot of people visit Drake Park without seeing it. I didn't see it, certainly, for the first couple of years I lived in Bend either. But some of you that are familiar with the river path, if you follow the path along the river in Drake Park, the memorial is slightly up a hill from that path. If you know how you kind of go around a few rocks that jut out toward the river as you're coming back toward town, it's shortly after that. And then further down from here is the bandstand, and even further down is the footbridge, if that helps you locate it if you want to look for it. But that memorial is still standing today. The sign that memorializes Frank, unfortunately, at some point in time, the photograph was either vandalized or it just faded, but this little circular bit in the middle at one point had his photo. And Phil and I are leading an effort at the moment to hopefully reinstall a new plaque here with a better photograph and with a new statement on the plaque itself. But it's worth quoting as a final gesture. It's worth quoting briefly from the memorial, from a memorial pamphlet that came out at the same time as his funeral, where they expressed the hope that at one point in time, at one point in the future, a memorial would be installed at the site of his drowning in the Deschutes River. So this is going back again to 1928. Someone had written in, a fellow member of the Socialist Labor Party, "Those of us who had the privilege of knowing Comrade Johns well understood the rare combination of manhood he carried, so soft and gentle, so considerate and sympathetic, so sincere and at the same time possessed of that dignity and firmness coupled with exceptional ability that made the thousands that knew him and have heard him from one end of this country to the other join with us today in offering our sincere respects and utmost admiration for his life of useful endeavor and his heroic attempts to save another member of the human family from perishing. Let us hope that in the not far distant future there sees towering over the banks of the icy Deschutes River a granite pillar showing the spot where our comrade performed his heroic act and gave up his life for another, and let us see their outstanding and brilliant letters, Frank T. Johns, faithful husband and father, in whom the proletariat lost a brilliant leader, the Socialist Labor Party lost its chosen standard bearer, and in whom mankind lost a real man. And that concludes my lecture this evening. So thanks very much, everyone, for coming out tonight and listening to my lecture. And I'm happy to field any questions if anyone has them. So.